In the remote Alaskan interior, a seasoned wilderness guide named Elias Crowe was about to break the oldest rule he lived by: never follow tracks north of the Ikagvik River. What began as a routine escort for a cryptozoologist turned deadly when something ancient and impossible began leaving tracks that shifted with every step. Elias Crowe wasn't your typical hunter. For over 20 years, he served as a U.S. Army SERE instructor, known for surviving an uncharted week alone in the Hindu Kush with a fractured femur and zero supplies. When the entity known as Qilaq began, warping reality and mimicking human voices, it had no idea it was facing a man who had trained soldiers to withstand psychological warfare in some of Earth's harshest environments. Elias set a controlled perimeter and initiated a containment plan that would ripple far beyond the frozen valley. What began as a guide job for a scientific podcast would become a confrontation with a multidimensional intelligence capable of rewriting time, memory, and fear. The Alaskan wilderness would never be the same after Elias Crowe decided to follow the tracks into the Forbidden Valley, and never came back out the same man. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches. You make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind bit through Elias Crowe's layers as he adjusted the straps on his pack, the weight settling comfortably against his back. Snow crunched beneath his boots, the only sound besides his measured breathing and the occasional distant crack of ice. The vastness of the Alaskan wilderness stretched before him, a pristine expanse of white broken only by the jagged silhouettes of spruce trees and the looming mountains beyond. He paused, scanning the horizon with eyes accustomed to reading the subtle language of this land. 20 years in these parts had taught him that survival depended on noticing what others missed. The storm building to the north gave him perhaps 3 days before it would descend, wrapping everything in its fury. 3 days to get Dr. Kashnik to her research site and, if he was lucky, back to safer ground. How much farther to our first camp? The voice behind him broke the silence. Elias turned to face Dr. Sienna Kashnik. Despite the cold, her eyes sparkled with an enthusiasm that made him uneasy. Scientists, in his experience, were too eager to poke at things best left alone. 2 hours, he replied, gesturing toward a ridge. There's shelter in those trees. We'll set up there for the night. Sienna nodded, adjusting her own pack. For someone who spent most of her time in lecture halls and recording podcasts about cryptozoology, she was keeping pace better than he'd expected. You're still convinced we shouldn't go north of the Ikagvik River, she said. It wasn't a question. The locals don't cross it in winter, neither should we. Because of superstition. Because people who know this land say not to. His tone was flat, final. But he knew from the week they'd spent planning this expedition that finality meant little to Dr. Kashnik. She smirked. The same people who told me about the white stag of Qilaq? The ones who swear they've seen it move through solid ice? Elias resumed walking, crunching through knee-deep snow. There's a difference between stories and warnings. And what did Nanook tell you when you visited her yesterday? I saw you slip away to her cabin. Elias's jaw tightened. The memory of the blind elder's milky eyes somehow finding his across her dim cabin made his skin prickle even now. She said what she always says. The ice has memories, some better left frozen. Sienna quickened her pace to walk alongside him. That's it? You spent an hour with her. We drank tea. This earned him a laugh that hung crystalline in the frigid air. The great Elias Crowe, man of few words and fewer explanations. Your reputation doesn't exaggerate. He didn't respond. His reputation had been built on bringing people back alive, not on conversation. After Sarah's death in the avalanche, after he'd failed to see the signs, he'd retreated into this wilderness, speaking only when necessary. The mountains didn't require small talk. They walked in silence for nearly an hour, the sun beginning its early winter descent. The temperature was dropping. Elias was calculating the remaining daylight when he noticed the tracks. He stopped so abruptly that Sienna nearly collided with him. What is it? She asked, voice suddenly hushed. Elias crouched, brushing away fresh powder to reveal the impression beneath. It was a track, but unlike any he'd seen in 20 years of hunting and guiding. Wide, nearly 18 inches across, with asymmetrical depressions as though the creature had limped, but the depth suggested enormous weight. "Bear?" Sienna ventured, kneeling beside him. Elias shook his head. "Wrong shape, wrong season, they're denning now." He traced the outline with his gloved finger. "This isn't right." The track had no clear toe marks, no defined pad. It seemed almost to shift shape the longer he stared at it, like an optical illusion in the snow. "Look ahead," he said, standing. 20 yards forward, another impression marred the snow, then another. The stride length was impossible, 8 feet at least, and each print seemed subtly different from the last. "My God," Sienna whispered, fumbling for her camera. "This is it. This is exactly what the elders described." The excitement in her voice had shed its academic restraint, becoming something raw. "You see how the tracks seem almost liquid, like they're changing?" Elias was already moving to the next print, unslinging his rifle from his shoulder. Training and instinct overrode the unease spreading through him. "These are fresh, hours old at most." "Follow them?" The hope in her voice was unmistakable. The tracks led north, toward the forbidden territory beyond the Ikagvik, toward the places marked with warnings on maps older than Alaska's statehood. "We make camp first," he said, already knowing he would regret what came next. "Then we follow, but only until sundown." Sienna beamed, snapping photos of each print. "The podcast audience is going to go crazy. Actual physical evidence of the white stag of Qilaq. We don't know what made these. The legends say it appears before great changes in the natural order, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, climate shifts." She looked up at the darkening sky. "Something's coming, Elias. Something big enough to wake it." Elias remembered Nanyuk's warning, the parts he hadn't shared with Sienna. The old woman had gripped his wrist with surprising strength as he rose to leave. "Qilaq test before it judges," she had whispered. "It will show you what you fear, then what you desire. If you follow to the end." When he'd asked what waited at the end, she had smiled, a smile with edges like broken ice. "Truth," she'd said, "or madness. They're often the same when the ice speaks." Now, examining these impossible tracks, Elias felt the first hairline fracture in his skepticism. In his years navigating this wilderness, he'd cataloged every animal print, every natural phenomenon. This was something else. They made camp efficiently as darkness closed in. Inside the tent with the stove radiating precious heat, Sienna spread her research notes across the insulated floor. Maps covered in scribbled annotations, printouts of centuries-old petroglyphs, interview transcripts from elders across 3 villages. "The earliest accounts describe it as half stag, half shadow," she explained, her breath fogging in the cold. "But it's not constrained by form. It shifts, adapts. The only constant is the white coloration and the distortion it creates in the environment around it." Elias cleaned his rifle, half listening. "And what does your scientific mind make of shadow creatures that bend reality?" "Science explores the unknown, not just the expected," she replied without looking up. "The most interesting discoveries happen at the edges of understanding." He grunted non-committally, but her words lingered. There had been a time when he too had been drawn to mysteries, to the raw wonder of this place. Before SERE, before the mountain had taught him that curiosity came with a price. In the morning they would follow the tracks north, against the warnings, against his better judgment. Outside the wind shifted, carrying with it the promise of the approaching storm. And beneath that familiar howl, Elias could have sworn he heard something else. A sound like antlers scraping against ice, rhythmic and deliberate. He zipped the tent flap tighter and tried not to think about Nanyuk's final words to him, spoken as he'd stepped back into the cold. "The ice remembers you, Elias Crowe, and so does what lives beneath it." Morning arrived with reluctant light, thin and gray. Elias emerged from the tent first, his breath clouding before him in the frigid air. The thermometer read -20, colder than it should be this time of year. He glanced at his compass and frowned. The needle swung lazily, settling briefly, at north before drifting west, then east as if pulled by competing magnetic fields. He tapped the casing. The needle spun in a complete circle. "Equipment malfunction?" Sienna asked, ducking out of the tent behind him. It was working yesterday. He pocketed the compass, uneasy. "We'll navigate by landmarks." The tracks remained, clearer in the morning light, and somehow different. What had been amorphous depressions the evening before now showed distinct features, 5-pointed indentations at one edge like elongated toes or claws. "They're changing," Sienna whispered, crouching beside the nearest print. "Look at this. Yesterday there were no distinct digits." Elias studied the track. She was right. These weren't new prints overlapping the old. The same impressions had somehow evolved. "Could be thawing and refreezing," he offered, not believing his own explanation. "In -20? With no precipitation?" Sienna was already photographing the tracks from multiple angles. "This confirms the accounts from Nanyuk's village. The entity doesn't just leave tracks, it leaves impressions that transform." They followed the trail northward, deeper into the territory Elias had promised himself he would never enter again. The spruce forest grew denser, branches heavy with snow creating tunnels of white. Sound behaved strangely here, their footsteps, sometimes echoing as if in a cavern, other times swallowed completely by the snow. By midday, the tracks had transformed again. Now they resembled hoofprints but distorted, too wide, with an asymmetrical gait suggesting a creature both massive and unbalanced. The stride length remained impossible, forcing Elias and Sienna to jog occasionally to keep pace. "The stories say it appeared to the first hunters as a white stag," Sienna said, voice hushed as if speaking in a sacred place. "But those who followed it too far reported it changing, becoming more like the person pursuing it." "Meaning what?" "Meaning it reflects back what we bring to it. Our expectations, our fears." She paused, studying his expression. "What scares you, Elias?" He didn't answer. The forest was too quiet now, the usual rustling of small animals absent. Only their breathing and the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots broke the silence. Near a frozen stream they found the bones. Antlers first, massive, spanning nearly 6 feet from tip to tip, emerging from the snow like gnarled, bleached branches. But as Elias brushed away the powder, wrongness revealed itself. The antlers twisted unnaturally, spiraling in configurations no deer could support. The skull beneath was elongated, the eye sockets too large and angled forward like a predator's. "My God!" Sienna's voice trembled with excitement. She was recording now, her small camera capturing everything. "This isn't consistent with any known species. The antler structure suggests cervidae, but the cranial formation, it's all wrong. We shouldn't disturb it." Elias felt a prickling at the back of his neck, an animal instinct he'd learned never to ignore. This could be a new species, Elias, a major discovery. She was already removing sample bags from her pack. Or an old one. He scanned the surrounding forest, unable to shake the feeling of being observed. One that doesn't want to be found. While Sienna collected bone fragments and hair samples stuck to the frozen remains, Elias widened their perimeter. 10 yards. From the carcass, he found fresh tracks. The same as those they'd been following, but now unmistakably humanoid. 5 toes. An arch. A heel. A footprint. Human-sized. The cold seemed to intensify, biting through his layers. The light dimmed, though the sky remained clear. And beneath the ice of the stream, just for a moment, he saw Sarah's face, blue-tinged, eyes wide with accusation, frozen in her final moment of terror as the snow had engulfed her. Elias stumbled backward, heart hammering. He blinked, and the vision vanished. Just ice. Just water flowing beneath. "Elias?" Sienna was suddenly beside him, her expression concerned. "What did you see?" "Nothing," he said too quickly. "Bad ice. We should move on." They camped that night in a natural hollow formed by fallen trees and accumulated snow. The temperature dropped further, the cold acquiring a strange metallic quality that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Throughout the afternoon, the tracks they followed had continued their unnerving transformation, sometimes appearing like the paws of enormous wolves, other times like hooves, occasionally like human feet. In the tent, Sienna reviewed her recordings, while Elias prepared a meager hot meal. The storm on the horizon had grown nearer, dark clouds building like a wall to the north. "We have one more day," he said. "Then we turn back, regardless of what we find." Sienna looked up from her camera display. "Is it the weather or what we're following that concerns you?" "Both." He stirred the pot of rehydrated stew. "This isn't natural, Sienna. You know that. That's precisely why it's valuable." She set down her camera. "I've spent my career being dismissed by proper scientists because I study the boundaries where folklore and biology intersect. They call my podcast pseudoscience. My own family thinks I've thrown away my education." Her eyes reflected the small flame of the cook stove. "But what if the myths exist because people encountered something real, something beyond our current understanding?" Elias recognized the hunger in her expression. It was the same drive that had once pushed him to test the limits of his own survival skills, to venture where others wouldn't, before consequences had taught him caution. "What happened to your wife?" Sienna asked softly. The question hung in the frigid air between them. Outside, the wind picked up, hissing through the spruce needles. "I was guiding her," he said finally. "She wanted to climb, to see what I saw in these mountains." The familiar ache spread through his chest. "I missed the warning signs, a slope too unstable, weather shifting too quickly. She..." Scritch, scritch, scritch. They both froze at the sound, something moving against the outer wall of the tent, something deliberate. Elias reached for his rifle. Sienna switched off her camera light, plunging them into near darkness save for the faint blue glow of the cook stove. "Elias." The whisper came from just outside the tent fabric, a voice like wind through hollow bone, somehow familiar yet distorted. "Did you?" Sienna began. "Shh." Elias raised the rifle, aiming at the tent wall. Nothing but fabric separated them from whatever waited outside. "Follow." Sienna's hand found his arm in the darkness, her fingers digging into his sleeve. The temperature inside the tent plummeted, their breath suddenly visible in plumes of white. The scraping sound circled them, moving around the perimeter of the tent twice before fading into the night. For long minutes they sat motionless, listening to the wind and their own ragged breathing. "It knows my name," Elias whispered. Sienna's scientific enthusiasm had given way to something more primal. Fear brightened her eyes. "The legends say, it calls to those it chooses." Neither slept much that night. When the pale dawn finally arrived, they emerged to find new tracks surrounding their tent, perfect circles, as if something had paced methodically around them. The prints led north toward a narrow pass between two ice-shrouded ridges, and for the first time, Elias noticed something extraordinary about the tracks. They were glowing faintly, with a blue-white luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. "We should turn back," he said, even as he knew they wouldn't. Sienna stood beside him, gazing at the ghostly trail disappearing into the storm-darkened pass. "It's showing us the way." Her voice held equal measures of terror and wonder. The wind carried ice crystals that stung their exposed skin as they followed the glowing tracks toward the narrow passage and whatever waited beyond. The pass narrowed until their shoulders brushed against walls of ancient ice. Compressed layers of blue-white told stories of millennia, darker bands marking volcanic eruptions, paler sections speaking of centuries of calm. Elias ran his gloved fingers along the surface, feeling an unnatural warmth emanating from within. "The ice shouldn't be this warm," he muttered. Sienna nodded, her scientific curiosity briefly overcoming her fear. "The thermal readings are inconsistent, almost as if..." She paused, frowning at her handheld thermometer. Impossible. What? Different temperatures in the same spot depending on how I angle the sensor, as if the ice exists in multiple states simultaneously. The glowing tracks led them deeper through the winding corridor of ice. The storm clouds above had sealed out the sun entirely, yet an ambient light suffused the passage, sourceless, tinting everything in a pale blue glow. Their shadows stretched and contracted unnaturally, sometimes preceding them, sometimes trailing behind. After what felt like hours of careful navigation, the passage widened abruptly. Elias stopped, stunned by what lay before them. A valley, stretched below, nestled between towering walls of glacier and stone. But unlike the frozen wasteland they'd traveled through, this basin teemed with impossible life. Vegetation that had no business growing in Alaska, let alone in winter, flourished in patches. Ferns with fronds wider than a man unfurled beneath stands of twisted trees bearing fruit that glowed like embers. In the distance, a herd of what might have been elk moved through high grass, their forms obscured by a perpetual mist that clung to the valley floor. Most striking of all was the light. Though the storm raged above, sealing out the sun with dark clouds, the valley was illuminated by what appeared to be sunlight filtering through the mist. Sunlight coming from multiple directions at once, casting overlapping shadows across the landscape. "This isn't possible," Elias whispered. Sienna stood transfixed beside him. "It's a microclimate, a pocket ecosystem preserved somehow." Her voice trailed off as she struggled to rationalize what they were seeing. "No microclimate explains this." Elias gestured toward the sun-dappled valley floor. "There's no sun today, and no sun creates light from 3 directions at once." A high, keening cry echoed through the valley, bird-like, but with a metallic resonance that set Elias's teeth on edge. He instinctively reached for his rifle, then hesitated. His training, his experience, his instincts, all the tools that had kept him alive for 2 decades in this wilderness, seemed suddenly inadequate, even irrelevant. They descended cautiously into the valley. The temperature rose with each step, downward until Elias found himself unfastening his outer layer. The air carried scents he couldn't identify, sweet, acrid, ancient. The glowing tracks led them toward a stand of those strange, twisted trees. As they approached, Elias noticed markings carved into the trunks, symbols resembling pictographs but unlike any indigenous artwork he'd encountered in Alaska. Some looked almost like writing, but no writing system he recognized. "Look, Sienna," whispered, pointing ahead. A stone monolith rose from the ground at the center of the grove, 8 feet tall, roughly rectangular, covered in the same strange markings. Its surface gleamed wetly, though there was no rain. Sienna approached it like a pilgrim at a shrine, her recorder held out before her. Preliminary analysis suggests artificial construction, likely predating known human habitation in this region. Her scientific vocabulary couldn't mask the awe in her voice. The symbols appear to be logographic, possibly relating to astronomical observations, some resemblance to Proto-Siberian patterns, but the execution is... She trailed off, tracing one of the deeper grooves with her fingertip. "More advanced," she finished quietly. "Sienna." Elias's voice was tight with warning. "Don't touch it." Too late. As her skin made contact with the stone, a pulse of that same blue-white luminescence traveled from the monolith up her arm. She gasped, not in pain but surprise, and stepped back. "It's warm," she said. "And it's... I felt it responding, like a current passing through me." Elias glanced at his watch, suddenly aware that the light hadn't changed since they'd entered the valley. The hands on his watch hadn't moved either. "Stuck at 11:42. What time do you have?" he asked, the first tendrils of real fear creeping up his spine. Sienna checked her phone. 11:42. "That's what I have. How long have we been here?" She frowned, checking the timestamp on her last recording. "This says 3 hours ago, but that can't be right. We just started recording." A sound like branches breaking drew their attention to the edge of the grove. Through gaps in the twisted trees, Elias glimpsed movement. something large and pale moving parallel to them just out of clear sight. "There," he whispered, raising his rifle instinctively. For just a moment the entity, was visible between two trunks. Tall, white as fresh snow, vaguely cervine in its upper portions but with a shape that seemed to ripple and flow rather than remain solid. Then it was gone, melting into the mist that clung to the valley floor. "Did you see it?" Sienna's voice trembled with excitement. "It's real. The white stag is real." "That's no stag," Elias muttered, tightening his grip on the rifle, even as he acknowledged its likely uselessness against whatever they'd just seen. They continued through the grove, following both the glowing tracks and their glimpses of the white entity. The mist thickened around them, playing tricks with distance and perspective. What seemed yards away might suddenly loom before them. What appeared close might take minutes to reach. Near a small, steaming pool, its water an unnatural emerald green, they found the cache. A leather trunk partially buried in soft earth that had no business being unfrozen in this climate. The leather was cracked but preserved, the brass fittings tarnished but intact. Sienna knelt beside it, brushing away dirt. "This can't be." She gently pried open the lid. Inside lay the equipment of a 19th century Arctic explorer, a sextant, a compass, carefully wrapped specimens in glass vials, a journal bound in sealskin. She lifted the journal with reverent hands, opening to the first page. "Expedition Journal of James Harrington, Royal Geographical Society, 1848, she read aloud. "We have discovered a passage through the ice that defies all natural explanation. Stevens believes we have found a new route to the pole, but I'm less certain. The light here plays tricks. The animals move wrong." Elias surveyed their surroundings, increasingly disoriented. The mist had thickened, and he could no longer see the passage by which they'd entered the valley. The monolith was visible, but somehow seemed both closer and at a different angle than he remembered. "We need to mark our path," he said, reaching for the surveyor's tape in his pack. But when he turned back to Sienna, she wasn't where she had been a moment before. She stood 20 yards away beside another stone structure, this one more clearly artificial, an entrance to what appeared to be a cave cut into the valley wall. "Elias," she called, her voice somehow both distant and immediate. "There are paintings here. Cave art." He hurried to join her, unable to shake the feeling that the distance between them had somehow stretched and compressed unnaturally. Inside the cave entrance, illuminated by that same sourceless light, ancient paintings covered the walls. Ochre and black figures depicted hunting scenes, celestial patterns, and a recurring motif of a white antlered figure that seemed to shift form across the narrative. "It's Qilaq," Sienna whispered, tracing the images with her eyes, but careful now not to touch. "Half stag, half shadow, just as the stories described. These paintings must be thousands of years old." "Which means that thing out there has been here a very long time," Elias said. "Or it exists outside of time altogether." Sienna's expression had changed, her initial scientific excitement tempered now by something like religious awe. "The legends say Qilaq guards the boundaries between worlds. What if this valley is such a boundary?" Elias checked his watch again. Still, 11:42. The unchanging light, the disorienting mist, the impossible flora. All of it suggested she might be right. "I can't tell which direction we came from," he admitted, a confession that cost his pride dearly. In 2 decades of wilderness survival, he had never lost his bearings. Never, until now. Sienna nodded, her expression softening. "I know. I think that's part of what this place does. It unmoors you from your certainties." She hesitated. "But I can feel which way we should go next. Since I touched the monolith, it's like there's a pull." Their roles had inverted. The scientist now spoke of feelings and instinct. The wilderness guide found himself adrift, his expertise rendered useless. "That thing is watching us," Elias said, glancing back at the misty valley. Once again, he caught a glimpse of white, the entity, observing from a distance. patient as the ice. Yes, Sienna agreed. And I think it's waiting for a decision. Which is? She pointed deeper into the cave system, where that same blue-white glow emanated from passages leading downward beneath the valley floor. We can leave the way we came never knowing, or we can follow it down. Her eyes reflected the strange light. I'm going down, Elias, with or without you. This is the discovery of a lifetime, maybe of all human history. Elias looked back at the valley once more, at the white shape that seemed to be slowly, deliberately, herding them toward the cave depths. Nanyuk's warning echoed in his mind. Truth or madness, they're often the same when the ice speaks. We go together, he said, finally. But at the first sign this gets worse, we retreat. Agreed? Sienna nodded, though something in her expression told him she had already passed the point of turning back. Together, they stepped deeper into the cave system, following the pulsing glow into the earth beneath the valley, searching for shelter from the coming storm and answers to questions he was no longer sure he wanted to ask. The descent was gradual at first, the cave floor sloping gently downward. The walls narrowed until they were forced to walk single file, Sienna leading, her hand occasionally brushing the stone as if maintaining some connection to the monolith she'd touched earlier. Elias followed close behind, fighting a growing sense of confinement that pressed against his chest. The air should be getting staler, he observed, his voice echoing strangely in the passage. We're at least 100 feet down, but it's still fresh, almost sweet. There must be an air circulation system, Sienna replied, her scientific mind still grasping for rational explanations. Natural vents or... A deep rumble interrupted her, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. The sound of the storm, above, Elias thought, until he realized they couldn't possibly hear it this far underground. The passage widened suddenly into a vast chamber that stole the breath from Elias's lungs. Columns of ice rose from floor to ceiling like the pillars of some ancient temple, each one containing dark shapes, suspended, preserved. The blue-white glow emanated from the ice itself, pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves like a heartbeat. My God, Sienna whispered, her voice small in the cavernous space. Elias approached the nearest column. Inside, perfectly preserved, was a human figure. A hunter, judging by the primitive weapons still clutched in its frozen hands, a spear tipped, with what looked like carved bone. The face was weathered, indigenous, locked in an expression of awe or terror. Around its neck hung an amulet, unmistakably shaped like a stag, but with elongated limbs that twisted unnaturally. They're everywhere, Sienna said, moving deeper into the chamber. Each ice column contained a similar figure. Hunters from different eras, judging by their clothing and weapons. Some appeared to be ancient, clad in furs and leathers that predated written history. Others wore more recognizable garb, 19th century exploration gear similar to what they'd found in the cache, and even modern cold-weather clothing not unlike their own. All wore the same twisted stag amulet. All had been flash-frozen in a moment of discovery or terror. These aren't just remains, Elias said, the realization crawling up his spine like ice water. They're trophies. On the far wall of the chamber, symbols like those on the monolith covered the stone in flowing patterns. Unlike the surface markings, these glowed with that same eerie luminescence, the light ebbing and flowing as if the very walls were breathing. Sienna approached, her recorder held out. The patterns are similar to those outside, but more complex. Some of the glyphs repeat. She studied them intently, comparing them to images on her phone. This one appears throughout the Inuit pictographic system, usually denoting guardian or protector. She pointed to another symbol. This one means boundary or threshold. Her finger traced a series of connected glyphs. And this sequence, I think it's an admonition. Remains undisturbed is the closest translation. Warnings, Elias muttered, just like Nanyuk gave us. A whisper brushed against his consciousness. not quite audible but somehow present in his mind. Images flashed behind his eyes, himself, younger, rifle raised, stalking through these same caves. But the prey in his vision wasn't animal. It moved like a man but was shaped wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the vision, but it clung like frost. "Are you all right?" Sienna asked, noticing his distress. "Hallucinating," Elias admitted. "I'm seeing myself, hunting something in these caves." Sienna's expression shifted from concern to realization. The entity might be projecting images. The Inuit elders spoke of Qilaq showing hunters their own deaths if they ventured too close. She glanced nervously at the frozen figures. "Or perhaps what we'd become if we stayed." Another rumble shook the chamber, stronger this time. Dust and small ice crystals showered from the ceiling. "That's not the storm," Elias said with certainty. They pressed deeper into the network of chambers, following the increasing intensity of the blue glow. The architecture of the cave system became more deliberate, the passages more symmetrical, as if they were moving from natural formation into constructed space. In the heart of the complex, they found the source of the light. A wall of pure ice at least 30 feet high, curved in a perfect semicircle around the chamber. Unlike the columns, this ice was clear as glass, and behind it something massive shifted. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the entire wall seemed to expand and contract in a slow, steady rhythm. With each expansion, the blue glow intensified. With each contraction, shadows danced across the chamber. Elias felt his grip on reality slipping further. The wall wasn't just moving, it was breathing. "It's alive," Sienna whispered, a tremor in her voice suggesting her scientific certainty had finally crumbled. "The entire structure is organic." Within the ice, Elias could now make out shapes, antlers, vast and twisted, a suggestion of limbs that seemed too numerous and wrongly jointed. Surfaces that appeared both solid and fluid simultaneously. The entity was both inside the ice and part of it, its true form impossible to comprehend with human perception. "We need to leave," he said, backing away slowly. "Now." But even as the words left his mouth, the blue glow intensified to near blinding brightness. The breathing quickened. The ice wall shuddered. "It knows we're here," Sienna said, her voice barely audible. "It's waking up because of us, because of me." The guilt in her voice was raw. "I did this. I wanted proof so badly that I ignored every warning." "We both ignored them," Elias countered, thinking of Nanyuk's words, of his own decision to follow the tracks despite his better judgment, his prideful belief that he, of all people, could safely navigate what others feared. A crack appeared in the ice wall, spreading like lightning across its surface. The blue light pulsed through the fractures, reaching toward them with tendrils of cold fire. "Run!" Elias grabbed Sienna's arm, pulling her toward the passage they'd entered through. But as they turned, they found it sealed, solid stone where the opening had been moments before. "It's changing the cave," Sienna gasped, "manipulating physical space." Another passage had opened to their right, one Elias was certain hadn't existed before. Through it, he could see a faint suggestion of the valley above, though twisted somehow, darkened. Behind them, the cracking intensified. Elias glanced, back to see a limb, pale, elongated, neither human nor animal, pushing through the fractured ice. The sight of it sent a jolt of primal terror through him that overwhelmed even his military training. They fled through the new passage, scrambling upward through increasingly tight confines. The stones scraped their shoulders, catching at their clothing. The claustrophobia Elias had been fighting surged full force, threatening to paralyze him. "Keep moving," Sienna urged from ahead, her voice tight with her own fear. "It's letting us out." "Or hurting us," Elias countered, but he pressed on. Better to face whatever waited above than what pursued them from below. The passage narrowed further until they were crawling on hands and knees. The blue glow followed, illuminating their desperate progress. Whispers surrounded them now, unintelligible but insistent. pressing against Elias's mind like probing fingers. He saw SERE again, not buried in snow this time, but standing in their home, begging him not to take her climbing. In the vision, he ignored her fears, confident in his abilities, certain he could keep her safe. The memory, real or manufactured by the entity, tore at wounds he'd thought long scarred over. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's using our guilt, he managed through gritted teeth. Don't listen. Ahead, Sienna had stopped moving. Elias, she called back, her voice strange. I can see daylight, but the valley, something's wrong. With a final push, they emerged from the earth like rebirth, gasping, covered in dust and sweat despite the cold. But the valley that greeted them was not the one they'd descended into. The lush, impossible vegetation had withered into twisted black forms. The multiple suns had vanished, replaced by a sickly green aurora that writhed across the sky despite the daylight hour. The mist remained, but now it moved with purpose, coiling around trees and rocks like searching tendrils. Most disturbing of all were the tracks. What had been isolated prints now covered the ground in overlapping patterns, hundreds of them, as if an army had marched through while they were below. Some were the familiar shifting impressions they'd followed from the beginning. Others were new, six-toed, clawed, elongated. It's not just one entity, Sienna said, her scientific detachment returning as a defense against terror. The legends got it wrong. Qilaq isn't a single being. It's a collective, a colony. In the distance, white shapes moved through the transformed valley, too numerous to count, too fluid to define. They seemed to be gathering, converging toward the central grove where the monolith stood. Elias's watch, frozen for hours at 11:42, suddenly ticked forward. The sound was shockingly loud in the unnatural silence of the valley. Something's changed, he said. Whatever was sleeping is fully awake now. Sienna clutched her recorder, though she'd stopped documenting their findings. Her hands trembled. I wanted discovery, she whispered. I wanted validation, not this. We'll find a way out, Elias promised, knowing it might be a lie. The valley entrance they'd used was nowhere to be seen. The entire landscape had reshaped itself while they were below. A faint crackle broke the silence, static, then a voice, distorted but recognizable as human. Elias fumbled for the satellite phone in his pack, which hadn't worked since they'd entered the valley. Crowe? Elias Crowe, do you copy? This is Ranger Dunning, your emergency beacon activated. What's your situation? Elias stared at the phone in disbelief. Rafe's voice, his brother-in-law, whom he hadn't spoken to since Sarah's funeral, was the last thing he'd expected to hear in this nightmare. Rafe, he responded. We're in trouble. Real trouble. The valley trembled beneath their feet. In the distance, the white shapes moved closer, more purposeful now. The entity, or entities, had noticed the communication. They were coming. The roar of a snowmobile engine cut through the unnatural silence of the valley, echoing strangely in the distorted landscape. Elias and Sienna turned toward the sound, hope and dread mingling in equal measure. Rafe Dunning appeared over a ridge, his Forest Service snowmobile kicking up black snow that should have been white. He wore the standard-issue parka of the Alaska Wildlife Rangers, his face obscured by a helmet and goggles. Even from a distance, the rigid set of his shoulders broadcast his fury. He skidded to a halt 20 yards from them, the engine dying with a sputter that seemed to offend the silence. For a moment, he simply stared at the transformed valley, his body language shifting from anger to confusion. What the hell is this place? He asked as he removed his helmet. Rafe's face was leaner than when Elias had last seen him 5 years ago at Sarah's funeral. New lines etched around his eyes, his dark hair now streaked with gray. The family resemblance to Sarah was still there, the same determined set of the jaw, the same questioning eyes. It's complicated, Elias said, painfully aware of the inadequacy of his response. Rafe's confusion hardened back into anger as he strode toward them. Your emergency beacon activated 6 hours ago. Coordinates put you in restricted territory. His eyes fixed on Elias with old hatred. Of course it would be you. Of course you'd ignore every warning, every restriction, just like with SERE. The accusation hung in the air between them. Sienna glanced uncertainly between the two men, sensing the weight of their shared history. Ranger Dunning, she began, stepping forward with her hand extended. I'm Dr. Sienna Kashnik. I hired Elias as a guide for my research. If anyone's responsible for our location, it's me. Rafe ignored her outstretched hand. Research? This area has been off limits since before statehood. There are no research permits. We followed tracks, Elias said, meeting his brother-in-law's gaze. Tracks like nothing I've ever seen. We need to focus on getting out now. All of us. This place isn't natural, Rafe. It's changing around us. Changing? Rafe snorted. You sound delusional. Again. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the withered black vegetation, the sickly aurora, the unnatural mist. For a moment, doubt crept into his expression. I've never seen terrain like this. The GPS was going haywire trying to find you. In the distance, one of the white shapes detached from the group, moving toward them with deliberate purpose. Its form seemed to flow, rather than walk, leaving those same shifting tracks in its wake. We need to move, Elias urged, grabbing his pack. Which way did you come in? Rafe pointed toward a narrow gap between two ice ridges. Through there, but I don't understand how this valley exists. It's not on any map. The topography is all wrong. It doesn't exist, Sienna said quietly. Not in our reality, at least, not completely. What the hell does that mean? Rafe demanded. It means we're in serious danger, Elias cut in. We can debate the metaphysics after we're safe. They moved quickly toward Rafe's snowmobile, the ranger still visibly struggling to process the impossible landscape around him. As they reached the vehicle, the mist thickened suddenly, tendrils coiling around their legs like curious snakes. The gap is right there, Rafe insisted, pointing ahead. A quarter mile straight through. But as they approached where the passage should have been, they found only a solid wall of ice. Rafe's expression shifted from confidence to dismay. This is impossible, he muttered, placing his gloved hand against the barrier. I came through here not 10 minutes ago. The white shape had drawn closer now, still maintaining its distance but clearly observing. Others had begun to move as well, spreading out in what looked disturbingly like a hunting formation. It's manipulating space, Sienna explained, her scientific detachment returning as a shield against panic. Just like it did in the caves. I've been mapping our movements. She held up her phone, displaying a GPS track that spiraled in impossible patterns. We're walking in straight lines, but the space keeps folding around us. They tried another direction, then another. Each time, they found themselves circling back to the same frozen clearing where Rafe's snowmobile waited. The white shapes drew steadily closer with each failed attempt. This is insane, Rafe growled, frustration overcoming his initial shock. He rounded on Elias. You got yourself into this mess just like you got SERE killed. Always pushing boundaries, always thinking the rules don't apply to you. Don't, Elias warned, old guilt mixing with fresh anger. She didn't even want to climb that day. She went because you pressured her. Because the great Elias Crowe couldn't. Imagine anyone not sharing his death wish. Stop it, Sienna stepped between them. This isn't helping us escape. A new sound froze them all. A woman's laugh, soft and musical, emanating from the mist around them. A laugh Elias hadn't heard in 5 years. A laugh that made the blood drain from Rafe's face. Hello, boys. Still fighting over me? The voice was perfect. Every nuance, every subtle inflection that had been uniquely SERE's. It came from everywhere and nowhere. What is that? Rafe whispered, his anger giving way to naked fear. What the hell is that? It's mimicking, Elias said quietly. It finds what hurts you most and uses it. Rafe, my little brother. The voice came from just behind the ranger, who spun to find nothing there, always trying to protect me, even from myself. "Stop it," Rafe commanded, his voice breaking. "Whatever you are, stop using her voice." "And Elias." Now the voice seemed to caress Elias's ear, so close he could almost feel breath. "My husband, so sure you knew what was best for us both." The mist coalesced, taking shape, a woman's form, translucent but unmistakably SERE. She stood between the brothers, her expression serene, her body composed of swirling vapor that never quite settled into solidity. Rafe made a choked sound, stumbling backward. His ranger training, his logical mind, all of it useless against this perfect simulacrum of his sister. "It knows our thoughts?" Sienna said, her voice tight with controlled terror. "It's accessing our memories somehow." The SERE shape smiled, the expression both perfect and wrong. "Not memories, guilt. So much delicious guilt between you." It turned to Elias. "You pushed me to take risks I wasn't ready for. You didn't listen when I was afraid." Then to Rafe. "And you, little brother, you never told him how I wanted to leave, how I'd packed my bags the night before the climb. Such a burden you've carried, keeping my secrets." Elias stared at Rafe, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. She was leaving me? Rafe's expression crumpled. She wasn't sure. She was scared. Of the mountain, of failing your expectations, but you never saw it. Never saw how hard she tried to match your fearlessness. The ground beneath them shuddered violently. A fissure opened in the ice, slicing through the clearing where they stood. Steam erupted from the crack, along with that now familiar blue glow, brighter now, almost blinding in its intensity. "You've awakened it completely now," the SERE shape said, her smile widening unnaturally. "The Qilaq sleeps for centuries, between tests. It judges whether mankind deserves to continue. And you've disturbed its deliberation." "What the hell is she talking about?" Rafe demanded, panic edging his voice. "It's not SERE," Elias reminded him, though he too found it nearly impossible to separate the entity from his wife's form. "It's using her to manipulate us." Sienna had moved to the edge of the fissure, staring down into the pulsing blue light. Her expression had shifted from fear to fascination. "I understand now," she said quietly. "It's not just a valley. It's a nexus point, where multiple dimensions overlap." She pointed to the sickly aurora above them. The distorted light, the impossible geography, the entity's ability to access our memories. It exists partially in our reality and partially in others. The SERE shape drifted closer to Sienna, studying her with cold curiosity. "The clever. One sees it now. This place has always been thin, a membrane between what is and what could be. The Qilaq maintains the boundary. It sleeps, it wakes, it judges. It has done so since before your kind stood upright." The fissure widened, chunks of ice falling into the glowing depths. The entity's white shapes had formed a circle around them. Now a dozen or more fluid forms gradually closing the distance. "There's only one way out," Sienna said, pointing down into the fissure. "Through the center." "You want us to go deeper?" Rafe looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "We should be trying to get back to the surface." "There is no surface to return to," she countered. "Not anymore. The valley's connection to our world is sealing. Can't you feel it?" Elias could. The air had grown thinner, harder to breathe. The colors around them had begun to desaturate, as if reality itself was being leached away. "If we stay here, we become like those hunters in the ice columns," he said. "Trophies." The SERE shape laughed again. The sound now distorted, multiple voices layered over each other. "The boundary weakens. The test begins." She pointed toward the fissure. "Enter the heart if you dare. Face the judgment." With that, the mist form collapsed, dissipating into the air. The white shapes drew closer, their movements becoming more aggressive, less fluid, more predatory. "Rafe," Elias said, gripping his brother-in-law's shoulder. "I never knew about SERE wanting to leave, I'm sorry." Something shifted in Rafe's eyes. a fraction of the old hatred giving way to shared grief. You couldn't have known. She didn't want to hurt you. He took a shuddering breath. But that thing, how could it know what SERE said to me in private? Because it's not bound by our limitations, Sienna answered, already preparing to descend into the fissure. Time, space, consciousness, it moves through them differently. The nearest white shape lunged suddenly, its form elongating impossibly as it reached for Rafe. Elias yanked him backward, barely avoiding the entity's touch. No more debate, Elias said. We go down. Now. The three of them positioned themselves at the edge of the fissure, staring down into the pulsing blue abyss. Reality itself seemed to bend at the edges of the opening, the air shimmering with potential energy. Whatever happens, Elias said, looking at both Rafe and Sienna, we stay together. Rafe nodded grimly, his ranger training finally reasserting itself in the face of immediate danger. For SERE, he said quietly. Below them, the heart of the Qilaq pulsed, inviting and terrible. Around them, the white shapes closed in. There was nowhere to go but down. For truth, Sienna whispered, and stepped over the edge. The fall lasted both seconds and eternities. Gravity itself seemed uncertain, alternately pulling them down with crushing force and then releasing them to float momentarily in the blue void. They descended through layers of reality that flickered and shifted around them. Sometimes ice, sometimes something organic and pulsing, sometimes pure energy that hummed against their skin. Elias reached out, managing to grasp both Sienna's and Rafe's hands, anchoring them together as they fell. Physical contact seemed to stabilize the fluctuations, creating a small bubble of relative consistency in the chaos. They landed softly, impossibly so after such a fall, on a surface that yielded slightly beneath their boots. Elias activated his flashlight, though the pulsing blue glow provided ample illumination. What he saw stole his breath. They stood in a tunnel that appeared simultaneously organic and artificial. The walls were composed of ice that flowed like liquid in slow, perpetual motion, yet maintained its form. Within the translucent surface, structures resembling veins or circuits branched in complex patterns, carrying that same blue luminescence throughout the system. Biomechanical, Sienna whispered, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what they were seeing. A fusion of biological and technological principles beyond our understanding. Rafe said nothing, his face pale, eyes wide as he took in their impossible surroundings. The ranger's practiced composure had cracked, revealing the terrified human beneath. The tunnel extended forward into darkness, curving gently downward. With no other options, they began to walk, their footsteps making no sound against the yielding floor. The air grew warmer with each step deeper, yet their breath still fogged before them, a contradiction that Elias's mind couldn't reconcile. The physics here are negotiable, Sienna observed, her voice unsteady but analytical. Multiple states existing simultaneously, like quantum superposition made visible. In English? Rafe finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled panic. Reality is thin here, she replied, different possibilities overlapping. As if to emphasize her point, a section of wall beside them suddenly displayed an image, moving, three-dimensional, as real as their own bodies. Elias froze, recognizing the scene. Himself as a young man, receiving the news of his parents' death in the fishing accident that had orphaned him at 19. The memory was perfect in its detail, down to the rain-soaked collar of the police officer who had delivered the news. "What is this?" Rafe asked, staring at the scene with horrified fascination. "My memory," Elias answered, unable to look away from his younger self's collapse into grief. "But I never told anyone those details, not even SERE." The image shifted, dissolving and reforming into a new scene. Rafe as a child, hiding in a closet while his father raged drunkenly through their small house. SERE standing protectively outside the door. Rafe made a small, wounded sound. "Stop it," he whispered. The wall rippled again, revealing a teenage Sienna being laughed out of a classroom after presenting a theory about cryptozoology to skeptical peers. "It's mining our minds," Sienna said, her scientific detachment wavering. "Testing us through our most painful moments." They pressed on, trying to ignore the moving tableaus that now appeared on all sides. Moments of shame, failure, loss from each of their lives played out in perfect, excruciating detail. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Sienna leading, Elias in the middle, Rafe behind. The light changed constantly, sometimes blindingly bright, sometimes dimming, to near darkness. Occasionally it fragmented into prismatic patterns that made navigation nearly impossible, as if they walked through shattered glass. "This isn't random," Sienna called back to them as another memory, Elias's first failed marriage, bloomed. On the wall beside him. "It's methodical, testing different emotional responses." "To what end?" Elias asked, averting his eyes from the painful scene. "To understand us, or to break us, or both." The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast, spherical chamber, so large that their flashlights couldn't illuminate the far side. At the center floated a structure, a perfect crystalline formation that resembled a geometric stag, its transparent, body containing swirling galaxies of blue light. The entity was massive, at least 30 feet from nose to tail, its antlers extending in impossible recursive patterns that seemed to fold into dimensions the human eye couldn't process. Most disturbing were its eyes, unmistakably human, dark and knowing, studying them with ancient patience. "Qilaq," Sienna breathed, her voice a mixture of terror and reverence. The chamber floor sloped toward the floating entity, creating a natural amphitheater. As they cautiously approached, gravity shifted again. They found themselves walking on what had been the wall, then the ceiling, their orientation changing with each step yet somehow remaining stable beneath their feet. "I can't," Rafe said suddenly, stopping his descent. His face had gone gray, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. This can't." "Breathe, Rafe," Elias instructed, gripping his brother-in-law's shoulder. "Focus on me." But Rafe's eyes had fixed on a new memory scene playing out beside them. Sarah's death on the mountain, the snow engulfing her as Elias screamed her name. A scene Rafe hadn't witnessed, but had clearly imagined countless times. "You let her die," Rafe whispered. But the accusation lacked its earlier venom. Now it was simply grief laid bare. "I did," Elias acknowledged. The admission cost him, but holding on to the lie that he'd done everything possible had cost him more over the years. The entity, Qilaq, shifted slightly, its crystalline form catching the light in new patterns. The memories around them froze, then dissolved. "It's responding to truth," Sienna observed. "Honesty creates stability." They continued their approach, the strange gravity bringing them closer to the floating entity. As they neared, Elias began to understand what they were seeing. The valley wasn't just a territory the entity protected, it was a containment system. The crystalline chamber was both throne and prison. "It's trapped here," he said with sudden certainty. "The valley, the time distortions, they're all mechanisms to keep it sealed away from our world." "No," Sienna countered, her eyes fixed on the entity with growing comprehension. "Not trapped, anchored. It exists across multiple realities simultaneously. This chamber is an anchor point, the only place where it maintains consistent form." Rafe had been silent, but now he moved with sudden purpose. The ranger unholstered his service pistol, aiming it at the crystalline heart of the entity. "Rafe, don't," Elias began. "This thing took Sarah's form," Rafe snarled, his composure finally shattered. "It's been torturing us with our worst memories. It's either a monster or a demon, and either way it needs to be destroyed." Before Elias could stop him, Rafe fired, 3 shots in rapid succession. The bullets never reached their target. They stopped mid-air, suspended in the space between Rafe and the entity, then reversed direction at impossible speed. Rafe cried out, dropping to his knees as an invisible force slammed into him. No blood appeared, no physical wound, but his face contorted in agony. It reflected his intent, Sienna said, rushing to the ranger's side. Not the bullets, the hatred behind them. Elias knelt beside his brother-in-law, who was gasping for breath, his eyes wide with shock. "What have you done to him?" he demanded of the entity. The crystalline stag's human eyes blinked slowly. Around them, the chamber transformed. The walls became transparent, revealing what lay beyond. Not ice or rock, but a thin membrane separating their reality from others. Countless others. Worlds where physics operated by different rules, where time flowed in alternate patterns, where life had evolved along paths inconceivable to human minds. And moving through all these realities, connected to each but fully present in none, were more entities like the one before them, Qilaqs shepherding existence itself along paths too vast for mortal comprehension. "My God," Sienna whispered. She approached the crystalline form, hand outstretched. "They're custodians, guardians of the boundaries between worlds." "Sienna, don't touch it," Elias warned, still supporting the trembling Rafe. But she was beyond. Caution now, drawn forward by a need for understanding that transcended fear. Her fingertips made contact with the crystal surface. Light exploded through the chamber, blinding in its intensity. When Elias could see again, Sienna stood motionless, her hand still touching the entity, her eyes wide and unseeing, filled with the same blue luminescence that pulsed through the crystal. "Sienna," he called, but she gave no indication of hearing him. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, layered with harmonics that echoed strangely in the chamber. "I understand now. It's beautiful. All of it." She turned to face Elias, her eyes still glowing with that unearthly light. "They maintain the boundaries, Elias. Without them, reality would bleed together, worlds collapsing into chaos. They sleep for centuries, then wake to test us, to ensure we haven't become a threat to the boundaries they protect." "And have we?" Elias asked, feeling small before the cosmic scale of what they'd stumbled into. "Not yet," Sienna replied. "But we're close. Our technologies are beginning to touch the edges of what should remain separate." Her expression softened with compassion that seemed both hers and not hers. "They don't hate us. They don't even judge us the way we understand judgment. They simply maintain the balance." Rafe had recovered somewhat, though he remained on his knees, staring at the transformed Sienna with a mixture of awe and terror. What's happened to her? She's been given knowledge, Elias realized. She touched it willingly, without fear or hatred. Sienna nodded, the movement slightly too fluid to be natural. "The valley is a testing ground. The entity allows itself to be perceived here, to be followed, to be found. It learns from each encounter, updating its understanding of our species' development." She gestured to the frozen hunters they'd seen. "Those who came with violence remain as records, examples of failed tests." The chamber trembled suddenly, the membrane walls rippling with increasing intensity. Beyond, Elias could see those other realities pressing closer, the boundaries growing thinner. "Something's wrong," he said. "The anchor is destabilizing," Sienna replied, urgency entering her voice. "Our presence, Rafe's attack, has weakened the containment. If it fails completely, the boundaries collapse." "Meaning what?" Rafe demanded, finally finding his voice again. "Meaning the end of our reality as we understand it," she answered simply. The crystalline stag's form began to pulse more rapidly, the blue light intensifying to painful brightness. The human eyes fixed on Elias with what he somehow recognized as a question, a choice being offered. "We have to decide," Sienna said, her voice returning slightly more to normal. "Leave now, destroy what we've found, pretend we never saw it." She swallowed hard. "Or stay, help restore the anchor, become part of the valley's secret." "Become like those frozen hunters?" Rafe asked incredulously. "No," she said. "Become guardians, like Nanyuk and her ancestors before her, watchers who understand what must be protected." Elias looked between Sienna, forever changed by what she'd touched, and Rafe, who represented the human world they'd left behind, a choice between transcendent understanding and human connection, between cosmic truth and earthly love. The chamber shuddered again, more violently this time. The decision could not wait much longer. The crystalline chamber fractured, along invisible fault lines, spiderweb cracks spreading across its surface. Beyond the thinning membranes, those other realities pressed closer. Worlds where gravity pulled sideways, where light had substance, where time ran backward. The boundaries between dimensions were failing. We need to leave. Now. Rafe had found his feet again, the ranger's survival instinct finally overwhelming his fear. Whatever cosmic importance this thing has, it's not worth our lives. Sienna shook her head, her eyes still alight with that unearthly blue glow. You don't understand what's at stake. If the anchor fails completely, our reality collapses. Not just this valley, not just Alaska. Everything. Then what do you suggest? Elias asked, watching as the crystalline stag began to dissolve, its form becoming increasingly fluid, less defined. One of us has to stay, she said. Become a conduit, a human anchor to stabilize the boundary until the entity can re-establish itself. You mean die, Rafe translated bluntly. No, Sienna countered. Transcend, evolve beyond our current form. She extended her hand, still glowing with transferred energy. I should be the one. I've already been touched. I've seen what waits beyond. Another violent tremor shook the chamber. Chunks of the ceiling broke free, floating upward instead of falling, defying what little remained of normal physics. The blue light pulsed in erratic patterns now, the entities, form fracturing further. We all leave, Rafe insisted, grabbing Sienna's arm. Whatever happens to this place, it's not our responsibility. It became our responsibility the moment we stepped into the valley, she argued, pulling away from him. The moment I touched the monolith. As they argued, Elias stood silent, watching the dissolving entity. In its human eyes, he saw something unexpected, not the cosmic indifference he had feared, but recognition, understanding, perhaps even compassion for the limited beings who had stumbled into its realm. The chamber walls rippled more violently, the glimpses of alternate realities growing more substantial. In one, Elias saw himself, older, gray-haired, surrounded by children who could only be grandchildren. A life he might have had with SERE, if he'd made different choices. In another, he saw only darkness, the void that might result if the boundaries failed completely. A figure began to form before him, coalescing from the mist and energy that filled the chamber. SERE, but not the same mimicry the entity had used before. This version was gentler, more honest. Her eyes held the wisdom of the entity behind them, but the love was genuine. You always wanted to protect everyone, the SERE form said, her voice an impossible blend of his wife's familiar tones and something far older. Even me, though I didn't always want protection. I failed you, Elias said simply. No. You merely loved as humans love. Imperfectly. Fearfully. She smiled with infinite compassion. But now you can love differently. You can save them both. Her gaze shifted to Rafe and Sienna, still arguing as the chamber crumbled around them. You can save much more than that. Elias understood then what he had to do. Perhaps had always been meant to do, from the moment he'd first seen those tracks, in the snow. Will it hurt? He asked quietly. Transformation always does, she answered. But not for long. He nodded. Decision made. He turned to Rafe and Sienna, his voice cutting through their argument with newfound authority. Sienna, you're going with Rafe. Now. Something in his tone made them both fall silent. Sienna studied his face, her enhanced perception allowing her to read his intent. Elias, no. I'm the one who's been prepared. I've touched it already. Which is why you need to survive, he countered. To remember. To warn others. He looked at Rafe. "And he won't leave without you, but he'll take you if I order him to." Rafe's expression shifted as understanding dawned. "Don't do this, Elias," he said, but with less conviction than before. "Don't repeat the same mistake. Don't think you have to be the hero." "Not a hero," Elias corrected. "Just the right tool for the job." He managed a tight smile. "Isn't that what you always said about me, Rafe? That I was too stubborn, too willing to push boundaries?" Another section of the chamber collapsed, revealing a tunnel upward, an escape route forming, perhaps with the entity's last coherent effort. "There's your way out," Elias said. "I'll stabilize things here long enough for you to reach the surface." "How?" Sienna demanded. Elias removed the pack from his shoulders. Inside were the emergency charges he always carried for avalanche control. Small, but powerful explosives designed to trigger controlled slides. "I'm going to collapse the main passage," he explained. "Seal this place away again. The physical disruption should buy enough time for the entity to reconstitute itself." He looked at Sienna. "That's right, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her still glowing eyes. "The anchor needs time to rebuild, centuries maybe. Which means no one else finds this place," Elias concluded. "No one else disturbs it." "You'll die," Rafe said flatly. "Maybe." Elias wasn't sure. He believed it himself. Death seemed too simple an outcome for what awaited him here. Or maybe something else happens. He began setting the charges at key structural points around the chamber. "Either way, you both need to be clear before I trigger these." Sienna approached him, her movements still unnaturally fluid. "The knowledge will fade from me once I leave this place," she said. "Not everything, but the clarity. I won't be able to explain it all." "You'll remember enough," Elias assured her. "You'll warn others away from here. That's what matters." The chamber gave another violent shudder. The crystalline stag had almost completely dissolved now, its essence spreading throughout the space, seeking a new vessel, a new anchor. Rafe came forward, standing awkwardly before the brother-in-law he had blamed for so long. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About SERE. About you. She chose the mountain that day. She always made her own choices." "We both loved her," Elias replied. "That's enough." One final tremor, stronger than all the others. The escape tunnel began to collapse at its far end. "Go!" Elias shouted. "Now, or none of us has a choice." Rafe hesitated only a moment longer, then grabbed Sienna's arm, pulling her toward the tunnel. She resisted briefly, her gaze locked with Elias's. "Tell the story," he told her. "Not just what it was, but what it meant." She nodded, finally allowing Rafe to lead her away. They scrambled into the tunnel just as another section of the chamber ceiling gave way. Alone now, Elias finished placing the charges. The blue energy swirled more intensely around him, tendrils of light probing at his consciousness. The SERE form reappeared, watching him work. "You understand what this means?" she asked. "What you will become?" "Not really," Elias admitted. "But I understand what I'm leaving behind. The guilt, the regret." He straightened, the detonator in his hand. "Those were heavier burdens than I want to carry anymore." The entities, light enveloped him now, the sensation both burning and soothing, breaking him apart at the cellular level even as it reconstructed him into something new. Through the pain came understanding, flashes of knowledge too vast for his human mind to fully comprehend. He saw Nanyuk in her cabin, blind eyes somehow meeting his across impossible distance. "This is what it always was," she told him, her voice clear despite the chaos. "A test, a choice, a transformation." He understood then that she too had once stood where he stood, had made a similar choice, though hers had been different: to return, to watch, to warn, to be the gatekeeper instead of the gate. With the last of his human consciousness, Elias pressed the detonator. The explosions came in perfect sequence, collapsing the chamber's supports. As the ceiling began to fall, the entity's essence flowed into him completely. The boundaries between Elias Crowe and Qilaq dissolved, just as the boundaries between realities had threatened to do. Time stretched, compressed, ceased to have meaning. The collapse that should have taken seconds extended into subjective eternities. In that stretched moment, Elias experienced lifetimes, his own past, presents that might have been, futures that now would never come. He saw Sienna and Rafe climbing, struggling through the collapsing tunnel system, saw them emerge into the valley above, transformed once again from the nightmarish landscape it had become back into the pristine, frozen wilderness it appeared to be. Saw them battle through the blizzard that now raged in full force, finally reaching Rafe's snowmobile, still miraculously intact. He saw them escape, carrying the story, or fragments of it, back to a world that would never fully believe them. And then Elias Crowe, what had been Elias Crowe, surrendered to the transformation. His consciousness expanded beyond the confines of individual identity, merging with the ancient awareness of the entity. The pain vanished, replaced by a sense of purpose so profound it transcended human emotion. The chamber collapsed completely, sealing the rift between worlds. The anchor, reconstructed through their joined essence, stabilized the boundaries once more. What had been broken began to heal. Deep beneath the ice, in a space that was both physical and not, the new hybrid consciousness settled into its vigil. The white stag of Qilaq would sleep again, perhaps for centuries, maintaining the delicate balance between realities that humans would never fully comprehend. But within that vast composite awareness, a small spark remained uniquely Elias Crowe, watching, remembering, at peace at last with his place in the universe. Above, the blizzard raged on, erasing all traces of tracks in the snow. 6 weeks later, Sienna sat in her Seattle apartment, staring at the recording equipment before her. The red light blinked steadily, waiting for her to begin. This would be the final episode of her podcast series, the culmination of her life's work, though nothing like what she had anticipated when she'd hired Elias Crowe to guide her into the Alaskan wilderness. She took a deep breath and pressed record. This is Dr. Sienna Kashnik, and you're listening to Borderlands Where Science Meets Myth. This will be my final episode. She paused, gathering thoughts that still refused to settle into neat scientific categories. 6 weeks ago, I followed a set of tracks into the Alaskan wilderness with my guide, Elias Crowe. What we found there defies conventional explanation. I've spent these weeks trying to analyze our findings using every scientific framework available to me. I've consulted with physicists, anthropologists, and indigenous knowledge keepers. I've reviewed my recordings, my samples, my memories. Another pause. The samples had revealed nothing unusual under laboratory analysis. The ice had melted into ordinary water, the bone fragments had crumbled to dust, the photographs had shown only blurry shapes that could be dismissed as equipment, malfunction, or pareidolia. The official report lists Elias Crowe as missing, presumed dead in a blizzard. The valley we discovered does not appear on any map, and the coordinates I recorded lead only to an impenetrable glacier wall. The wildlife ranger who assisted in our rescue, Rafe Dunning, has declined all requests for interviews and has transferred to a remote outpost in the Brooks Range. She didn't mention the nightmares that plagued them both. Rafe's angry, drunken call at 3 a.m. last week had confirmed that he too saw the white stag in his dreams, heard the whispers in languages that shouldn't exist. The academic community has responded to my preliminary findings with skepticism. My university has placed me on sabbatical, citing concerns about my mental well-being following a traumatic survival situation. Sienna glanced at the formal letter of reprimand on her desk, the carefully worded suggestion that she seek psychiatric evaluation before returning to her teaching position. Next to it lay her letter of resignation. What I can tell you with certainty is this: there are boundaries in our world, not just physical ones, but boundaries between what we understand and what exists beyond our comprehension. Sometimes those boundaries thin, sometimes they tear, and something watches from the other side. She picked up the small object that sat beside her microphone, a carving no larger than her palm, made from a material that resembled ivory but wasn't. A stag with impossibly twisted antlers, its eyes inlaid with some blue stone that seemed to catch light from within. 3 days ago, I visited the village where our expedition began. I spoke with an elder named Nanyuk, a blind woman who had warned Elias before our journey. She was expecting me. The memory of that meeting sent a chill through her even now. The old woman had been sitting outside her cabin despite the bitter cold, her milky eyes somehow tracking Sienna's approach. With perfect accuracy, she knew my name without introduction. She knew what we had found. And she gave me this. Sienna held the carving up to her webcam for those listeners who followed the video version of her podcast. A totem of Qilaq passed down through her family for generations. You are the watcher now, she told me, the keeper of the boundary. Sienna set the carving down gently. Its weight seemed greater than its size should allow, as though the dense material contained something more than mere matter. Among Elias's personal effects, recovered from our last camp, was his journal. The final pages contain drawings and text that don't match his earlier entries. She opened the weathered book to the marked page. The symbols resemble those we found in the valley, and the text, it's not in any language I recognize, yet somehow I understand fragments of it. She didn't mention that she'd awoken one morning to find she had transcribed 3 full pages of this unknown language in her own handwriting, with no memory of doing so. The fragments I can interpret speak of cycles, of sleeping and waking, of testing and judgment, of boundaries maintained across millennia by beings that view our existence as a momentary ripple in a vast ocean. Outside her window, snow had begun to fall, unusual for Seattle this early in the season. The flakes seemed to hang suspended longer than they should, as though time itself hesitated around them. The scientific community asks for evidence for reproducible results. They want something they can measure, categorize, publish in peer-reviewed journals. But what we encountered exists beyond those frameworks. It challenges not just what we know, but how we know it. She closed Elias's journal, tracing her fingers over the cover. The leather felt warm beneath her touch, though it had been sitting untouched for hours. I've been asked, ordered really, to stop speaking about what happened, to classify it as a stress-induced hallucination brought on by extreme conditions and isolation, to accept the logical explanation that we became disoriented in the storm, that Elias died trying to find help, that Ranger Dunning rescued me before I suffered the same fate. Sienna stood, moving to the window. The snow was falling more heavily, now blanketing the city in silence. But I can't do that. Not because I'm seeking validation or scientific acclaim. I've abandoned those pursuits. But because what we found is waking again. The boundary is thinning, and someone needs to remember, someone needs to watch. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the surface. For just a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of blue light reflected in the condensation. Gone so quickly she couldn't be certain it had been there at all. 3 days ago, after leaving Nanyuk's village, I saw tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, not entirely. They appeared and disappeared as I watched, shifting shape with each new impression. No one else could see them. But I could. She didn't mention following those tracks for hours, abandoning her rented car on a Forest Service road, trudging through deepening snow until darkness forced her to turn back. Didn't mention the white shape she'd glimpsed between the trees, watching her with eyes that were somehow Elias's and not Elias's simultaneously. The tracks led south, toward populated areas, toward cities and technologies that push at the very boundaries Qilaq protects. She returned to her desk, sitting before the microphone again. I don't know if Elias Crowe is truly dead. I don't know if what sleeps beneath the ice has been contained or merely transformed. I don't know if I'm now part of something vaster than human comprehension, or simply a traumatized scientist clinging to irrational explanations. She picked up the carved totem again, its blue eyes seeming to watch her with ancient patience. What I do know is this. If you see tracks in the snow that shift and change as you watch them, tracks that seem to lead somewhere impossible, you have a choice. You can follow as we did, driven by curiosity or ambition, or the simple human need to know. Or you can turn away respecting that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond our understanding. Sienna hesitated, then added, if you choose to follow, remember this. The Qilaq tests before it judges. It will show you what you fear, then what you desire. The price of knowledge is transformation, and not everyone survives becoming something new. She reached for the stop button, then paused, adding one final thought. Elias Crowe followed tracks in the snow and became something more than human. I followed Elias and became what I am now. A watcher, a keeper of stories too strange for science, too true for mere myth. What you become, if you choose to follow, will be uniquely yours. Choose wisely. She ended the recording, knowing it would never be published through her university channels, knowing too that it would find its way to those who needed to hear it through other means. The boundary between knowledge and ignorance was thinning too in its way. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Sienna gathered her coat and the carved totem, suddenly certain she needed to be outside. Something was calling her, not with sound, but with a pull she felt in her altered consciousness, a tug on threads that connected her to what Elias had become. In the fresh snow outside her building, she found what she had both feared and expected: tracks. Different from those they'd originally followed, smaller, more deliberate, almost human, but not quite. And beside them, larger impressions that could only belong to Qilaq in its stag-like form. Two sets of tracks, moving in parallel, guardian and guide. For a long moment, Sienna stood motionless, snow gathering on her shoulders. The choice she faced now was not whether to follow. She had made that decision weeks ago in the crystalline chamber. The choice was whether to go alone or to bring others with her, to share the burden of knowing, of watching. She knelt to examine the tracks more closely, her fingers hovering just above the impressions. The snow beneath her hand glowed faintly, blue for the briefest moment. Acknowledgement, invitation, warning. "I see you, Elias," she whispered. The wind picked up, swirling snow around her in patterns too precise to be random, almost like writing, like the symbols that filled the final pages of Elias's journal. Then it settled, and the tracks continued onward, waiting for her to follow. Sienna straightened, her decision made. She would follow, but not alone. The story needed telling. The warning needed witnesses. The boundary needed more than one keeper. In a world growing more complex by the day, she pulled out her phone and sent a brief message to the 3 colleagues who had shown genuine concern rather than dismissive skepticism when she'd returned. Then she took her first step forward, following the double set of tracks into the gathering storm. Behind her, her own tracks remained, human, ordinary, a bridge between worlds that would soon be covered by fresh snow, waiting for new followers to discover. The cycle continued as it always had, as it always would. A hunter following tracks in the snow, finding something beyond explanation, and becoming part of a story older than human memory. And somewhere beyond the veil between realities, the entity that had once been Elias Crowe waited patiently for those with the courage to seek understanding, and the wisdom to accept its price. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.